Hello, friends. My name is JJ. And you know that one line from the intro song to American Dad where he says, "The sun in the sky
has a smile on his face, and he's shining a salute to the American race."
The joke is obviously that there is no such thing as the American race, because Americans are not a racial group. Americans are a diverse assortment of people who have descended from migrants from all over the world. And that is the case for Canadians as well. And yet, even in a country built by migrants, new racial groups still have the possibility of emerging over time. Or, to put it in a more anthropological way, when enough time has passed, people have the capacity to start perceiving themselves as being part of some new racial group. When I was looking at the most recent Canadian census the other day, I was surprised just how many Canadians consider themselves to be at least partially ethnically North American, over 10 million. Obviously, the biggest faction of this group are the Native Canadians. 2.2 million Canadians claim to have at least some Indigenous North American heritage, with 1.4 million specifically claiming North American Indian or First Nations heritage, and another 82,000 claiming some Inuit heritage, the distinct Indigenous people of the far north. But that still leaves an additional 8 million Canadians claiming some other North American ethnic identity. So how can this be? How can you be ethnically North American if you're not Native American? Well, luckily, the census gives us the names and numbers for all of the different specific ethnic identities that make up this category, which fit into basically 6 big subgroups. And today I thought it might be fun if we go through them all one by one and see what we can learn about Canadian history from them. But first, a quick word from today's video sponsor, Incogni. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to my presentation. So, what would you say is one of the biggest problems facing the internet today? That's right, data security. And what do we mean by that? We mean companies getting access to our phone numbers, our addresses, our shopping habits. And what does that mean? It means more spam, more scams, and less security for our personal information. And does anyone know how they get all this data? That's right, through ordinary, everyday activities like searching and shopping. And so what can we do to solve this problem? Well, we can send emails to every website we've ever been to and ask them to delete whatever information they have on us. But do we want to do that? No, we don't. So what is the solution? Incogni. Incogni is a service that sends out data deletion requests to all of the big data brokerage companies and tells them to get rid of any personal information they have of yours. It's quick, it's elegant, and as you can see, they have already successfully completed 149 data deletion requests on my behalf. And you guys are going to love this. You can even ask them to delete the information from a specific website that you submit. Okay, so how do you get this? Well, you can go to incogni.com/JJMCC or use the promo code JJMCC to get an amazing 60% off an annual subscription and a 30-day money-back guarantee. All right, but don't applaud me. Applaud Incogni. All right, so it might not surprise you to learn that by far the largest category of ethnic North American in Canada is French Canadian. Canada, after all, was originally a colony of France before it was conquered by the British in the mid-18th century. But what happened in the aftermath of that conquest was very significant for Canadian demography because the British basically cut off all further French migration to the continent as they began trying to repopulate Canada with English settlers instead. And this created a very special perception of solidarity among the French settlers that remained. There was a strong sense that the French were now this very numerically restricted group whose survival could only be ensured by having lots of children, which they did. French Canadians famously had quite gigantic families until quite recently. Celine Dion, for instance, had 13 brothers and sisters. And it was this project of having independently organized their own self-perpetuation in the face of an imperial project to wipe them out that played a key role in the self-perception of the French Canadians as a uniquely North American ethnic group. There are some interesting ways that this legacy manifests in modern-day Canada. The fact that much of the French-Canadian population is descended from a rather limited number of families means that a lot of French-Canadian people tend to have the same last name. Tremblay, Boulanger, Fortin, LeBlanc, Bouchard, and of course, Dion would all be some examples of stereotypically French-Canadian last names that I think most Canadians would probably recognize as such. Now, I should note that most Canadians of French heritage conceptualize their background in the same way that Canadians of German background or Italian background or Chinese background or whatever would. In other words, they would say, I'm a Canadian of French heritage, or my family originally comes from France, or something like that. Identifying your background as explicitly French-Canadian is kind of the most hardcore thing to do, and signals your desire to conceptualize your ethnic identity as something entirely of this continent and barely even connected to France anymore. The same is true for the nearly 1 million Canadians who describe themselves as having some Quebecois background. Quebec is, of course, the Canadian province where the majority of French Canadians live, and there has always been a political project afoot to turn this province into a sort of pure French Canadian homeland or nation state. Identifying as an ethnic Quebecois is a controversial manifestation of this, since it represents a desire to fuse the idea of living in this particular geographic place with the French-Canadian ethnic identity, which can provoke tensions with the millions of people who live in Quebec but are not French-Canadian. The question of who properly gets to call themselves Quebecois can be a touchy and contentious topic over there. And if that's not geographically particular enough for you, we have 3 additional factions of French Canadian. Around 15,000 Canadians consider themselves to have Gaspésian heritage. This refers to people from the Gaspé Peninsula, which was the first part of Canada to be claimed by the French way back in 1534. If you could somehow trace your family's heritage to the first settlers of Gaspé, you would truly be an incredibly OG North American. 24,000 Canadians, meanwhile, claim to have Franco-Ontarian heritage. These are basically French Canadians who wound up in the province of Ontario. Today, Franco-Ontarians tend to get a lot of attention from the Canadian and Ontario governments because, even though they're a small minority, their presence in Canada's largest English-speaking province helps reinforce a certain idea of Canada as a country with a strong French presence everywhere. If you look at this video I took of the Ontario legislature in Toronto, you can see that they're flying the Franco-Ontarian flag alongside the national and provincial flags. And then the third big French-Canadian community is the Acadians, which some 305,000 Canadians identify as being part of their heritage. So back when they controlled Canada, the French Empire also controlled this peninsula, which is now the provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but at the time was a single thing known as Acadia. The British conquered it in 1713, and in 1755 began a process of what we would now call ethnic cleansing, wherein they attempted to expel all of the French settlers to make way for British ones. And most were either deported or fled, though there remains a significant minority of French Canadians in New Brunswick to this day. The expulsion of the French from Acadia remains this very memorialized episode in Canadian history, and reinforced a sense of solidarity among the French who remained, not unlike the French in Quebec. A lot of modern-day Acadians, accordingly, have a similar sense of pride in themselves as a uniquely North American people for that reason. All right, having talked about the French, let us now talk about that other very canonically important Canadian ethnic group, the English. Canada has a lot of people of English extraction, but there is one small group of Canadians who claim to be a very uniquely North American style of British, the United Empire Loyalists, which is an ethnic identity claimed by over 10,000 Canadians. 1,200 Canadians claim this is their only ethnic identity, which is pretty wild. United Empire Loyalists are the descendants of English settlers who left the United States after the American Revolution of 1776. It is often claimed that about a third of the people living in the 13 colonies didn't support the project of overthrowing British rule, and thus sought to flee to some other part of this continent where the British were still in charge. United Empire Loyalists were a significant source of English migration to Quebec and the former Acadia, and in that sense were critical to the British colonial project of displacing French settlers from the territories that they had just conquered from France a few decades earlier. The Loyalists have been very heavily sentimentalized in a certain old-fashioned conservative telling of Canadian history, which I made a whole other award-winning video about. Their migration was initially used to justify a certain political idea that Canada should be like an opposite version of America, less democratic and more unquestioningly loyal to the British Empire. These days, I feel like knowing your family is of United Empire Loyalist heritage is a very stereotypically white, middle-class Canadian dad sort of thing. A certain kind of middle-aged man can make a great hobby out of learning the life story of his loyalist ancestors. You know, documenting how they were surely some sort of very important big shot in colonial America, only to be tragically driven from their homes and forced to make a harrowing journey through the New England wilderness before finding safety and shelter in the welcoming bosom of British Canada. They actually sell magazines that explicitly cater to the interests of loyalist dads, keeping you up to date on all of the latest conventions and reenactment festivals and that sort of thing. There is also a dark side to the United Empire Loyalists, however, and that brings us to our next group, the African Americans. Canada has a decently sized black population these days, but the vast majority of them, like close to 90%, are either immigrants from Africa or the Caribbean or their children. The Canadian population of African Americans, by contrast, which is to say the descendants of people who have lived on this continent for centuries, first as slaves and then as free men and women, is vastly smaller. A total of 73,000 Canadians consider themselves to have the ethnic heritage of Black North Americans, which is then divided into 3 groups. So Canada in the early colonial times was too small and poor to have a particularly large population of enslaved people. The African slaves that did exist were mostly personal servants owned by upper-class Frenchmen in the colonial elite. This changed following the American Revolution and the subsequent Loyalist migration. Many United Empire Loyalists were wealthy men who owned slaves in the 13 colonies and thus brought them north when they fled. At the same time, a lot of so-called Black Loyalists came to Canada too. These were Blacks that had taken up arms in defense of the British side during the Revolution, in exchange for freedom after the war. Many of the Loyalist slave owners and free Blacks settled in Nova Scotia. And the British even had a policy of trying to concentrate Canada's Black population to Nova Scotia in order to make the race situation more quote-unquote manageable. After slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, it then became British policy to try to get all of the Blacks of Nova Scotia to emigrate back to Africa. They wanted them to settle this new colony for free Blacks that the British abolitionists had set up, known as Sierra Leone. But that idea didn't really take, and today there are over 6,400 Canadians who claim Black Nova Scotian heritage. Like Black people elsewhere on this continent, the Black Nova Scotians historically had to fight against prejudice, and their plight is often emphasized in Canadian history books as an important example of minority groups fighting for equal rights in less enlightened times. The woman on the Canadian $10 bill, Viola Desmond, was a Black Nova Scotian woman who went to jail for refusing to sit in the colored section of a segregated movie theater. A much different and much larger wave of Black Americans came to Canada in the mid-19th century. In the lead up to the US Civil War, laws protecting the rights of slaveholders became much stricter, which made even anti-slavery northern states seem less safe than they used to. This then led to a brief surge of enslaved Blacks emigrating to Canada, most famously through the so-called Underground Railroad, organized by American anti-slavery activists like Harriet Tubman. That said, it's important that we don't overstate the significance of the slavery era too much. African Americans have often immigrated to Canada in other eras as well, for all sorts of reasons, just like every other kind of person has. Drake's father was an African American immigrant to Canada, for instance. In all, over 66,000 Canadians claim to have either African American or African Canadian heritage. I'm not really sure what the difference would be. Somewhat paradoxically, I would assume that people who identify as having African Canadian heritage are probably more likely to be the descendants of American slave refugees, just because they would probably be more likely to conceptualize their ancestors as having become Canadian. All right, moving on. 353,000 Canadians claim to have simply American heritage. Another 5 million claim to have simply Canadian heritage. Likewise, in every province, there are thousands of people who claim their ethnic identity is just whatever province they're from. So there are 80,000 who claim Ontario heritage, 16,000 who claim Saskatchewan heritage, 38,000 who claim New Brunswick heritage, and so on. 2,400 Canadians claim their only ethnic identity is Prince Edward Islander, which is interesting. We have more pure stock Prince Edward Islanders than pure stock United Empire loyalists. Near as I can tell, the sort of people who put down this sort of thing in the census are mostly just white people whose families have been in North America for so long that they've lost track of where in Europe they originally came from. Somewhat less flatteringly, this can also indicate Canadians who are just broadly ignorant of their own heritage, or in some cases, very righteous Canadians who don't like the idea of disclosing their ethnicity to the government. Generally speaking, the size of the provincial ethnic categories more or less correlates with the rank of that province's relative population size, with 3 exceptions. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are quite small provinces, but a disproportionately large number of Canadians ethnically identify with them. This is probably because, as we've discussed, these provinces are some of the oldest settled parts of Canada, so they'd be most likely to have people who have lost track of their family history. Because they've been historically quite poor places, they've also tended to have quite high rates of out-migration. So it makes sense that Canadians living elsewhere might identify as having family heritage there. It's interesting that about 13,000 Canadians specifically claim to have Cape Breton heritage. Cape Breton is an island off the coast of Nova Scotia that during the 18th and early 19th century was administered separately from the rest of Nova Scotia. Unlike the mainland, which was historically settled by Scottish Protestants, Cape Breton Island was historically settled by Irish Catholics. My Nova Scotian YouTuber friend Art Chad sent me this remarkable photo, the sign from a part of Cape Breton where there is a large Acadian population. So you can see it is half in French and half in Gaelic. That's some very intense Canadian ethnography in action. Newfoundland, meanwhile, is the most extreme outlier of all. Newfoundland is another part of eastern Canada that was first settled a very long time ago. Its colonial history apparently begins in 1497, according to the t-shirts. Because it's an island, Newfoundland has a reputation for having a white population that has historically been cut off from the rest of North America and somewhat inbred as a result. I don't mean that in like an overly pejorative way. It's just to say that there are parts of any country where relatively isolated and rural places have tended to have more of a historic tradition of inbreeding, and that plays a role in the formation of ethnic identities. In any case, today you will sometimes meet white Newfoundlanders who think of themselves as a distinct North American ethnicity in the same way that the French Quebecers do. And this is part of the reason why, in recent years, some activists in Newfoundland have made a real effort to get the nickname Newfie, which is a traditional insult for a dumb Newfoundland person, treated like a racial slur. It is also worth noting that Newfoundland only joined Canada in 1949, having spent much of the last 100 years operating as a completely independent country. This means that historically, Newfoundlanders would have been considered immigrants, and thus having Newfoundland heritage would have been considered something more significant to be aware of, compared with having heritage from some other part of Canada. I remember I once had an elementary school teacher who had Newfoundland heritage, and this was something she often felt a need to bring up. All right. Now, even though I said we were not going to talk about the Indigenous Canadians, there is one distinctly Canadian ethnic group that is kind of complicated as far as that goes. Over 500,000 Canadians claim Métis heritage, and they're a very interesting group to examine just because they are probably the most explicit example of the idea of a new race being created on this continent. So we understand that the white man first came to the east coast of North America and then gradually spread west. Many of the first white migrants to the west were, in turn, French-Canadian fur traders, adventurous men willing to go on long, uncertain hikes through the Canadian wilderness at a time before roads or trails or even maps existed to help them find their way. These are very romanticized characters in Canadian history, sometimes called the voyageurs or the coureurs de bois, meaning the runners of the woods. These men would inevitably encounter Native Americans, just as the white men of the East did, but their interactions with Indigenous people are often framed as being more modest and kind and egalitarian. This wasn't because the French-Canadian fur traders were necessarily morally better people. They just represented a very different kind of colonial project. As traders of furs, they were seeking to gain a better understanding of the geography of this continent and its animals, which made cooperative relationships with the native peoples a more obvious imperative than it would have been for the military guys in the East who just wanted to force the Indians out of the way and take their land. Traditionally, Métis, which is an old French word meaning mixed, referred to the mixed-race children who were inevitably produced by the meeting of Indigenous and French peoples in the North American interior during the 18th century. In the area that is now the province of Manitoba in particular, the mixed-race community would eventually grow so large and sophisticated, it became a whole civilization unto itself, with unique traditions of agriculture and language and religion, born from fusing aspects of French-Canadian culture with the culture of the native peoples of the Canadian prairies, particularly the Cree and Ojibwe. To this day, there are a lot of people who insist that to be a true Métis, you have to be a descendant of this very particular time and place. There was, of course, a lot of anti-Indigenous racism in Canada for much of its history, and a lot of whites regarded people with mixed white and Indian blood to be weird half-breeds, which was actually considered the normal, socially acceptable way to refer to Métis people until distressingly recently. Because Métis people were often marginalized by white society, the argument goes that for most intents and purposes, they have functioned as Indigenous people for most of Canadian history and are thus properly regarded as a type of Aboriginal Canadian more than a type of white person or some other third category. When the Canadian Constitution was revised in 1982, Métis people were specifically identified as one of 3 types of Aboriginal people in Canada, alongside the Inuit and the North American Indians. In practice, this means that Métis people are generally eligible for many of the same unique legal rights and protections as other types of Indigenous Canadians. The thing that's always been distinctly challenging about the category of Métis, however, is just that the exact boundaries of the definition are very hazy, especially in the context of our modern era, where being part native is no longer considered particularly stigmatizing and might even be something that a lot of Canadians are proud to claim about themselves. The idea that any Canadian with any Indian heritage has a right to call themselves Métis is a pretty controversial one, but it's clearly happening. Over the last 20 years, Canada's Métis population has almost doubled, mostly through growing self-identification, and this has in turn played a significant role in increasing the number of Canadians identifying as Indigenous overall and obtaining all of the various legal protections and benefits that come with this. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but when you listen to what some of the leaders of some of the more established Métis organizations say, it is pretty clear that they think a lot of this is just white Canadians faking it, in a kind of Elizabeth Warren type way. The idea that you should have to prove enrollment in some sort of formal Métis organization in order to claim the identity is a fraud check that you hear proposed a lot, but then that just invites further debate over which Métis organizations are valid and which ones are scams. Anyway, I've always been very curious about what contemporary Métis culture is like. Here in Vancouver, most of the few Métis people that I've encountered have been mostly of the I identify this way because I have some native blood in my family history sort, as opposed to the I come from a long line of proud Métis people sort. Books and articles about the Métis tend to focus a lot more on their history and contemporary political activism than modern cultural identity. That said, there are a few very specific Métis traditions in the realm of high culture that tend to be cited a lot, particularly fiddle playing and beaded clothing. In some ways, Métis culture has always reminded me a bit of like Scottish Canadian culture, where there are like certain very specific traditions of dress and music that you can choose to care about if you want to connect with your heritage in a very overt and visible way. But in a more day-to-day sense, a lot of people with this background now just sort of blend into mainstream Canadian culture. If you have any particular insights or experience with the Métis community, please let me know in the comments because, like I said, it's always been quite intriguing to me. Okie dokie, and lastly, we have one final group, the Pennsylvania Dutch, which 17,000 Canadians claim as part of their heritage. The Pennsylvania Dutch are actually of German origin. Dutch is an English corruption of Deutsch, not a reference to like Dutch in the Holland sense. The Pennsylvania part, meanwhile, refers to the American state of Pennsylvania, which back when it was still a British colony, attracted a lot of German immigrants from small and unpopular Christian denominations seeking religious freedom. Today, we mostly associate the Pennsylvania Dutch with the Amish, a uniquely North American subculture of fundamentalist Christianity known for very stubbornly clinging to an ostentatiously old-fashioned way of life. Since Pennsylvania isn't far from the Canadian border, some of these people wound up in southern Ontario. A while ago, I was visiting my friend who lives in a rural area called Perth County. I was very delighted to see the Amish people with their buggies and hats and beards and all that, just like on TV. Though 70% of the Pennsylvania Dutch in Canada live in Ontario, there was also a small community of them in Alberta and British Columbia. These are mostly the descendants of fundamentalist Germans who emigrated to Western Canada as homesteaders in the late 19th century. These people tend to be Mennonites rather than Amish, though the culture can seem pretty similar to outsiders. As a kid, I sometimes remember seeing the women with the long dresses and the bonnets selling jams and quilts at the farmers' markets and things. So there you go. The big 6 distinctly Canadian races. I mean, obviously they're all still products of migrants from other places. No one in Canada, not even the Indigenous Canadians, just spontaneously sprung from the soil. But it's still an interesting thing to think about. At what point can we say that a group of people have truly become North American and are defined more by their identity as it relates to this continent versus the continent that their ancestors originally came from? In any case, it's worth remembering that Canadians claiming ethnic North American heritage still barely comprise a third of the overall population of this country. For better or worse, a nation of immigrants, we remain. Have you ever known anyone from the Big 6? Did they have any particular connection to their distinct historic culture? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next week.